This video will describe some of the physiological adaptations with altitude training, and to start off with, we'll review some basic principles regarding barometric pressure and the partial pressure of oxygen. So if we go up in altitude, we know that the barometric pressure, the total air pressure, is going to decrease. And if this barometric pressure decreases, the air is less dense at altitude, then the partial pressure of oxygen, that will also decrease. Therefore, less O2 molecules per volume of air, so less oxygen molecules. But the percent of oxygen remains the same. So the total air is less dense. There's a less number of total air molecules. Yet out of that total, the percent of O2 remains the same as it is down here at sea level. At altitude, the atmospheric pressure decreases, yet the same percentages of the gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and mainly nitrogen. But this calculates out to a lower partial pressure of those gases. And some terms, hypoxia is a low partial pressure of oxygen with altitude. Normoxia is normal at sea level. Hyperoxia would be a higher than normal, or that higher than sea level partial pressure of oxygen. So we know that the barometric pressure is a measure of the pressure exerted by the weight of the air above us. So it's how much, what's the pressure of this air pushing down on us. And so this is barometric pressure, and it varies with elevation. At sea level, the standard value is 760 millimeters of mercury. And so we go up in altitude, for example, Mount Everest. You can look online, or it's estimated to be maybe about 200 millimeters of mercury. So obviously on top of Everest compared to sea level, there's a big difference in this total barometric pressure. And it also varies with temperature as well. So colder air versus warmer air. But the composition of the air remains the same. So yes, the total air pressure is less. The air is less dense. Yet out of that air, it's the same components. We're not changing the components of the air. So the composition is still 20.93% oxygen, 0.03% carbon dioxide, and most of it, 79.04% nitrogen. But since the calculation of the partial pressure of gases is that fraction times the total air pressure, since the total air pressure is less, that partial pressure of the gases is going to be less. So if we take, for example, oxygen, oxygen is 20.93% expressed as a fraction, 0.2093, and if we use a sea level a sea level barometric pressure, then 0.2093 times 760 is 159 millimeters of mercury. So that is a typical value for room air partial pressure of oxygen at sea level. And we can estimate what room air would be on top of Everest. So if the total barometric pressure is about 200 millimeters of mercury, remember the percent of O2 does not change. So the percent of O2 is still 20.93%. So 0.2093 times 200 is 40 millimeters of mercury. And that is a crazy low partial pressure of room air oxygen, so PO2 in room air. And we've discussed the rate of diffusion of gases, and part of that equation for rate of diffusion of gases is due to the differences of the partial pressure of gases across some kind of gradient. So that's P2 minus P1. It's a direct relationship. So as that partial pressure difference is greater, the rate of diffusion of gases is greater. So here's a picture, and you know some of these values. So if we look up here at the top of this picture, the PO2 in room air is 159, so that's what we've calculated out at sea level. And we lose some oxygen, so that partial pressure will change a little bit in the trachea, and in the lung alveolus, it's estimated to be about 100. So the PO2 in the lung alveolus is about 100. So what would be the PO2 gradient of getting oxygen out of the lung and into the venous blood? Well, follow this arrow. That's going from 100 to 40. So typical venous blood at a resting condition and at a sea level condition is about 40 millimeters of mercury. So 100 minus 40 would be 60. So that's the delta PO2, or that's P1 minus P1 minus P2. But if we go up in elevation, and this PO2 now would be less, right? And in fact, on Everest, it's 40. So that would be room air of 40. The lung alveolus is going to be less than that. And venous blood is 40. So you can see that at really high elevations, I mean, it's almost impossible. That's why we need a tank of oxygen to be able to diffuse oxygen into the venous blood. And you can look online, and there's some confusion if you look online, because I've mentioned that the composition of the gases stay the same. And there are some online charts, and these charts, and I'll drag one over, these charts represent a simulated change in altitude. And so here's a company called Hypoxico, and they have this online chart. And this online chart is not a true difference or a true drop in the percent oxygen. They've just calculated out, let's say if we go to Flagstaff, Arizona, which is 7,000 feet, well, they've calculated out that the decrease in barometric pressure at altitude of 7,000 feet could be simulated by a 16% oxygen content. And what Hypoxico does, the reason they do this, and the reason, and we have been able, in our exercise physiology lab, we've been able to purchase one of their oxygen pumps. So this oxygen pump will not change barometric pressure. That's really hard to do, actually. And you need a completely sealed like chamber or room to be able to change that pressure. So what Hypoxico has done is they have this pump that will actually scrub out oxygen. So now air that someone is breathing from this pump, it is actually less percent of oxygen. So if we wanted to go up to, for example, 7,000 feet, Flagstaff, Arizona, we could set the pump so it's scrubbing out enough oxygen to equal 16%. But that's a simulated condition using, a specialized oxygen scrubber, oxygen pump. Normal conditions, when we go up to altitude, the barometric pressure is what changes. The percent of oxygen and the percent of the gases do not change. So what happens with performance? Well, obviously with long-term performance, because of this lower partial pressure of oxygen that we're starting with, there's going to be less hemoglobin that is saturated with oxygen, so aerobic performance is typically poorer. Short-term aerobic performance, short-term anaerobic performance, because the air is less dense, it probably would not have an effect, or it actually could improve performance, like sprinters or throwers. The air is less dense, so there's less air molecules that you have to throw, a javelin, or that you have to run 100 meters. So those performances can actually increase. VO2 max, as you would predict, VO2 max goes down. So with altitude, VO2 max decreases. And so for every 300 meters, so that's about 1,000 feet, so there's a 3% decrease. And that starts at about 5,000 feet. And so here's a chart. And so here is the percent of VO2 max. And here is altitude, and this is in thousands of meters, and they also have it here in feet. So there were Mexico City Olympics years ago. That's about 7,000 feet. And so VO2 max is 90% of a sea level condition. And one of my former colleagues, Dr. Jack Daniels, who was professor in exercise physiology and also the cross-country coach here at SUNY Cortland, he did some of this research on the Mexico City Olympics. I've been to Leadville, Colorado. That's 10,000 feet. So VO2 max will decrease. And if you go up really high, VO2 max decreases even more. So VO2 max will decrease with altitude. Submax. So if you're running at a submax pace, the oxygen consumption of that submax pace, it's going to be the same. Yet that is now at a higher percent of your VO2 max. Since VO2 max decreased, you're now working out at a higher percent of your VO2 max. The VO2 of that submax didn't change, but since VO2 max went down, you're now working out at a higher percent of your VO2 max. The effects of altitude on submax exercise performance, it's a higher heart rate. So at whatever pace you're running or biking, that's going to elicit a higher heart rate. And that's because you have lower oxygen content, so blood hemoglobin is less saturated. That CaO2 is less. So the heart rate responds by increasing cardiac output, trying to pump more blood. There's also an increase in ventilation, so breathing. And this is because reduction in number of oxygen molecules per liter of O2, that is hypoxia. And here the drive for breathing, for ventilation at altitude, it is a low oxygen, not an increase in pCO2. So at sea level conditions, at rest and at easy exercise, the drive for ventilation is trying to blow off the increase in CO2. Yet at altitude, the drive for ventilation is trying to suck in, trying to increase oxygen. And here is heart rate over oxygen consumption, or VO2. And if we pick a certain oxygen consumption, you can see this line represents sea level conditions, and this line is 10,000 feet, so that's pretty high. And that heart rate is, of course, higher. And if we pick ventilation, here's a couple different altitudes. We pick an oxygen consumption here at sea level, and if we go up in altitude, that breathing rate, pulmonary ventilation in liters of air per minute, at that given VO2, at that given exercise intensity, it's higher. And what are the adaptations? Well, our body tries to produce more red blood cells to counter that desaturation of hemoglobin. And those adaptations are less complete if you just arrived. They'll increase as you stay at altitude in training. They'll probably never match sort of high altitude natives that live at altitude. But you'll increase red blood cells and then try to increase that oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. So many athletes will do altitude training camps or trying to train at altitude. So the effect of training at altitude on VO2 max varies between athletes, and this seems to be due to the degree of saturation of hemoglobin. So there's individual variability of some people seeing a larger decrease in hemoglobin saturation. Some people see less. Some athletes can really improve their VO2 max and improve their performance by training at altitude. Others cannot. Maybe how well they were trained when they started training at altitude. There's some evidence of responders versus non-responders to training at altitude. So some athletes have a higher VO2 max when they return, and others do not. And this may be due to a detraining effect where they cannot train as hard at altitude. So these next couple slides are just some sort of flow charts of the effects of altitude, and you can look at our textbook and some other notes that will describe this. So higher altitude means a lower barometric pressure. A lower barometric pressure means a lower partial pressure of oxygen. Lower partial pressure of oxygen means lower O2 delivery. We're getting less oxygen to the working muscles. And a less oxygen, less VO2 max, less VO2 max, less work capacity. You can't do as much. So a drop in endurance performance in some athletic events. Higher altitude means air is less dense. Less dense air means less air resistance. And so the drop in air resistance is a better economy and a better speed. So for those sprinters or throwers, performance can improve. So the benefits of training at altitude, as I've mentioned, the increase in hemoglobin is a benefit. An immediate way to concentrate hemoglobin is by decreasing the total plasma volume. So that's actually not a benefit. At altitude, the submax performance is perceived to be more difficult, and it's at a greater percent of VO2 max, as I've explained. So actually, some athletes, especially elite level athletes, if they train at too high an altitude, they may become detrained. So I'll see if I can explain this. And this is sort of the background for live high, train low. So here's a picture that I made. And so on the left-hand side of this picture, this rectangle represents someone's VO2 max at sea level. And as we've described, VO2 max will decrease with altitude. So this rectangle that is yellow is their new VO2 max at altitude, and obviously this VO2 max has decreased. And let's just pretend you're a fast runner. You can run 6-minute mile pace, and your coach has just said that today's training is going to be a high intensity day where you want you to be running at this 6-minute mile pace. And that is equal to, this lightning bolt, that is equal to 90% of your max. So it's a pretty high intensity training day. If you did that high intensity training day at altitude, you couldn't do it. So you still want to run a 6-minute pace at altitude, but that 6-minute pace now is now at a higher percent of your altitude VO2 max. And in fact, the way I've drawn it in this picture, it's actually above your VO2 max. You could not be doing this 6-minute mile pace at altitude. So some elite level aerobic athletes, if they train at too high of an altitude, they become detrained because now they want to achieve 90%. So if 6-minute mile pace at sea level equals 90%, and I'll show you what they would do. They would have to decrease their training speed at altitude to equal 90%. But now 90% at altitude is no longer a 6-minute mile pace. I'm just sort of making up these numbers. But let's say now it's an 8-minute per mile pace. So they're actually running slower. So they're actually doing less work. So they would be detrained. So what some people have proposed is to live high. So by living at altitude, but training at sea level. So they're still able to train at this condition, but they can live at a high altitude condition where they can see the benefits of increased hemoglobin and increased red blood cells production. That then could be a benefit per performance. So there's been several studies actually, that have looked at some elite level runners that have done living high, training low. And so exercising with altitude is now at a higher relative percent of VO2 max because VO2 max has decreased. And so elite level athletes that train at such a high intensities, like my example of 90%, they actually have to slow down. So the idea of live high, train low, they can live at altitude or even sleep at altitude and get the benefits of red blood cell production and more hemoglobin. But then they can train at sea level, so they can train at such high exercise intensities where it's not going to have an effect. And actually, that same company, Hypoxico company, they can attach the high altitude pump like what we have in our lab, and they're building like chambers to go over your bed and a tent, so you can sleep in this tent. You can adjust the pump such that you're at 7,000 feet or even higher. And you can see an increase in hemoglobin production and increased red blood cells and increased hematocrit, all those positive variables of training of living at altitude. But then in the morning, open up your tent and turn off the pump and go train at high exercise intensities that would give you the benefits of training at such a high exercise intensity. And it's interesting research. Some of it has worked, meaning some of the results of these studies have seen a positive benefit. Not everyone has, so there's still some question if it's the best way to do training, and it's hard to control for all the different conditions. So this was a little bit longer video to show some basic altitude stuff and some changes in barometric pressure and the partial pressure of oxygen, some of the adaptations at altitude, and to explain this training technique of live high or sleep high, yet train low.